You're listening to the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast with your host, Andy Plimer.
For someone to explain,
bringing you up-to-date coaching concepts from the world of rugby. Sharing ideas to make the game better.
Okay, thanks for joining us for episode number 4 of the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast. Joined today with a very special guest, Mark Upton. Mark is from Adelaide in South Australia, and after 12 years of working in coaching and sports science at a professional Aussie rules club, he took up his current position as the coaching science manager at the English Institute of Sport early in 2014. His current role, Mark works closely with UK sports world-class coach development programs and has a brief to help coaches optimise their practice and learning environments in regards to decision-making, performing under pressure, technical change, and developing problem-solving athletes. I did some professional development with Mark 2 years ago when he was back in Australia, and I was there for a short trip, and I learned so much in that very short period of time. So it was natural for me to ask him to come onto the show. So really happy to have you on board, Mark, and thanks for joining us.
Not a problem, Andy. More than happy to have a chat and looking forward to it, mate.
Awesome. So unfortunately, your background is Aussie rules. So tell me a bit about your backstory with regards to sport, education, previous roles up until your current role in England.
Yeah, well, growing up in Adelaide in South Australia, so in the southern states, Aussie rules, rightfully so, is the premier football code. That was what I was heavily influenced by. Not so much. I played a bit, never at any great level, but yeah, certainly as a observer and fan of the game, I suppose that was number one. But yeah, I was just generally interested and got involved, just casually, if you like, in a number of ball sports in particular. How did then things from a professional point of view? Did a sports science degree at University of South Australia. Then was pretty fortunate to get an opportunity at the Adelaide Football Club, so one of the 2 Australian rules clubs in Adelaide. So I didn't even have to move, which was nice, and that gave my start in more the I guess traditional sports science area, which is fitness, conditioning and that aspect, but then evolved into more performance analysis, skill acquisition through some links we had with the Australian Institute of Sport, and then just more into coaching and towards the end of my time there, a bit of coach development, which by that time I was also doing some consulting in coach development and skill act, which is how we sort of ended up having a chat, Andy.
Yeah.
And then got the role at the EIS sort of about 18 months ago in coaching science, which is a new role, which sort of captured a lot of, I guess, what I've done in the past, as well as some other areas into a lot of actually trying to better understand this whole caper of coaching. What is expert coaching? How do you develop expert coaches and all those sort of things? So, yeah, it's really interesting and enjoying the time with the family over in the UK.
Fantastic. And you've got the Rugby World Cup coming up, so you can get immersed in the great game.
Yeah. So that's, going to be, really interesting. I mean, I enjoy watching all sporting events, so whilst I can't say that I'm a out-and-out rugby fan, it's going to be fantastic, over the next few weeks for sure.
Great. Okay, so going on, you mentioned coach development there a number of times. What do you think are the biggest challenges in terms of more so coach education today with regards to skill acquisition?
There's probably been a number of challenges in the area, and skill acquisition has probably struggled in terms of its identity, if you like.
Yep.
And one of the reasons is who owns it. So whilst it's got a scientific and theoretical basis, it's obviously relates to core coaching business, if you like, in terms of the practice sessions and developing athletes or players' technical and tactical skills. And so I think just starting there is why it's then struggled to maybe make an impact. And then in terms of coach education, probably a lot of coach education programs and coach educators don't really have a great awareness of it either, so it tends to get skipped over or very lightly touched on. But I think that's changing quite quickly. And then the interesting one, we talk about coach education being formal learning.
Yep.
I think where we're seeing change and momentum grow is more informal learning. And I'll use things like Twitter as an example, and I've had probably a handful of coaches mention to me now how they find Twitter a really useful resource, particularly with some of the Skillac content and sort of getting up to speed with some of that and then trying some of it out in their own practice sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I follow you on Twitter, and you put out some great stuff all the time. So there's a wealth of information out there for sure.
Yeah.
So in terms of skill acquisition, what do you feel are some of the key concepts that coaches who, everyone talks skill acquisition, but the actual meat and bones of it, what are some of the key concepts that coaches need to understand about it?
Yeah, well, it's funny, only today I've been drafting up something to almost explain what skill acquisition is, because whilst in its literal term you think skill, and so maybe it's just the technique of passing or kicking. Mm-hmm. It is really broad, and it's it's that I guess that's saying that skill is decision making plus the movement or the action under some sort of time pressure or other pressures, anxiety, fatigue, those sorts of things. So yeah, if we look at skill from that point of view, it deals with all of those things. Yep. So, as I guess the certain fields in science evolve as well, it's, like what does neuroscience have to say about the brain and decision making, and how do we move and best learn to move, and there's a whole lot that sits under it, but generally it's about perceptual skills, so players' ability to pick up on cues or information in the environment, which obviously then forms decision making, as well as their ability to adapt their movement or actions to fit the context. I try to stay away from actually using the word technique.
Yep.
As technique, I think we get too fixated on that in isolation. So I like to talk a lot about adaptive movement, which is underpinned by perceptual and decision-making skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that term, adaptive movement. And just on the perception side of things, I remember the work we did together. You talked a lot about the perception-action coupling. Are you able to explain that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so I guess probably what we start to understand about learning and learning a task is, again, historically, and if we look at that technique approach, we've just focused on the action and worried about developing the action or technique and assuming that will transfer, if you like, then into different tasks or different environments where there's suddenly decisions being made and we have to perceive, positioning of teammates, opponents, and it's a dynamic environment. But what we're probably learning is learning is task specific, and what makes it specific is the information available in the environment when we learn.
Yeah.
So obviously there's a need to perceive that. So as I said, learning a pass or a kick in isolation is not the same as learning it when I also have to perceive movement of teammates in opposition. And it's not to say there's no transfer, but it seems you might get better transfer or more efficient use of your time by maintaining this perception and action coupling.
Right.
Is one way to explain it.
So would you say then, like in terms of practice design, coaches should be attempting to try and make their practice sessions look as much like the game as possible?
Yeah. I mean that's its. We always got to be careful of simplifying things too much, but I think that is a fair simplification of that term. Is trying to make practices realistic, and what makes them realistic, is the presence of attackers, defenders, and whilst in some phases of rugby and other team sports it's highly structured, a lot of the time it's unstructured or uncertain in a way, isn't it? So we do have to perceive these things and adapt our movements. They're not too pre-planned.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the restarts of the rugby game, kickoffs, drop kicks, scrums and lineouts, they're very, very structured. But then after that, in open play, every scene that you see is completely different.
That's right. at some scale. So we'd say sometimes if you zoom out, you see common patterns emerging at a broader level, but it's down sometimes actually at those micro levels, like when players just see a gap to run through, or positioning of an opposition player, one foot slightly positioned in front of another means they might not be able to change to a certain direction as quick. It's those small little differences that the expert players are probably really what we call attuned to, sensitive to, perceive well, and obviously, and if being able to exploit those little things and those little gaps is what then creates the bigger change and bigger openings for scoring or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. One of the other things we talked about was block practice versus random practice, and how blocked you can get some initial bang for your buck, but the long term is not that great. But whereas random, it's a little bit messy, but it's far more sustainable. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a rule of thumb, and I guess some studies do support that random, which is maybe practicing a variety of skills in a random way, as the term suggests, the success rate, completion rate, execution rate, whatever you want to describe, might not be as high as if you to just block a whole lot of passing. But if we take into about transfer and the other concept of retention is sometime later, then potentially that random practice actually the performance is higher, is transferred and retained better than the block practice. As a rule of thumb, there's always exceptions as well, but that's what would go on.
Yeah, and I think that's that's across all sports. Is a lot of coaches really strive for that perfect looking practice where everything looks great, and the old coach saying at the end, we're not leaving until we get this right, kind of thing. But often it needs to look messy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I know there's a quote from Graham Henry, actually, if you do want to make it rugby specific, to say that's obviously a number of years ago, but that's sort of what they started to stumble on themselves with the All Blacks, was that random or chaotic training, in his words, result in better longer term learning, which is what he means there, is that transfer and retention.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, great. So for people who are new to kind of these terms, or new to trying out different techniques, often you start coaching the way you were coached. What would you advise them to do in terms of trying to accelerate skill acquisition in their sessions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, that how do you accelerate it? Because one of the challenges with learning sometimes is it does take time. I think a good starting point comes back to one of the good old-fashioned skills of coaching, is observation.
Yeah.
And really working out whether it's an individual player or a unit or the team as a whole, what we call that rate limiter, what is really stopping them from being better at a skill or better at a tactical concept. Is it their perceptual skill? Are they missing cues? Are they not scanning? Is it to do with, they're limited in the range of passes they can maybe execute, which is, narrowing their options. So I think it actually starts with really good observation. And then if you get a clear idea of what is the problem, rather than just a cliche type answer, I think then you're in a good place to apply some of these skill app principles around designing your practice session. And, from there, sometimes you see really dramatic and quick improvement. Other times it's still, takes time to see that transfer into a match environment. And at some time you might have to come back and just think, is this really working? Do I need to mix it up or try something different? So it's still that, if you want to describe that, art, or what I call that complexity of coaching, where there's no guarantees, but I think there's sort of some principles you can follow.
Yeah, and I think a lot of coaches think like coaching's like paint by numbers. That if you get the sequence right, then the results will come. But it's so dynamic, team to team, and your opposition and the environment you coach in. So yeah, that's great advice. One of the other things we talked about was constraints led approach to practice. Can you explain that a little bit more, and kind of maybe some examples of how that might work?
Yeah, well, I think this is one thing about this before, Andy. Actually, it's probably hard just to talk about it. So maybe I can give you a couple of links that you can throw
absolutely.
into the podcast so people can read and maybe see the diagram and visualize a little bit more.
Yep.
And in a way, sometimes I describe it as what good coaches have probably done for a while anyway. It's sometimes described as a bit more hands-off coaching. So a constraint, I think I normally start with what is a constraint. Well, I guess it's a boundary, but it more dictates maybe what a player can't do rather than prescribing what they can or should do.
Okay.
And it maybe sounds like a subtle difference, but it actually makes a big difference. So, and obviously we're constrained in different ways. And the three high-level categories in a constraints model is the task, the individual person or player, and the environment, which could be the physical properties of the environment, like the hardness of the surface or rain or wind, but also, and probably even where I think this is really interesting, is the social and cultural environment as well.
Yeah.
Influences your immediate actions and performance, and also your learning and development longer term. So the easiest way to think about constraints, so individually, anatomically, we're constrained with how we can move.
Yeah.
So whilst we've got lots of ways we can move, but there are certain things that are physically impossible for humans to move or do. And so that's an example where that's a boundary where there's lots we can do, but there's a certain few things we can't. And if you say task constraints, well, every sport's got task constraints because there's things called rules.
Yeah.
So in rugby, you can't pass forward.
Yeah.
But that still means there's hell of a lot of ways and directions you can pass. So it's this idea of it creates boundaries, and a coach will skillfully in practice manipulate those constraints, particularly tasks like pitch size and number of players and rules and how you can score and those things to sort of shape and guide learning outcomes and development for players. But it gives the player space to search and explore probably for the solutions that suit them best. So rather than prescribe the perfect technique or the one tactical option, in the longer term done well, it does develop these really adaptable players because they have more than one trick up their sleeve, if you like. So that's a quick snapshot as best I could describe, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, would you say like a games-based approach lends itself well to constraints?
Exactly. So whilst constraints-led approach doesn't have to just be games, it obviously is closely so that's what underpins a games-based approach in small-sided games, because you are manipulating certain task constraints there. But it could still be a drill, is what we'd more classically call a drill. And you might, again, manipulate the rules or constrain it in certain ways so that there is still this variability or some randomness to it rather than it being blocked and just repetitive, constant repetition. So, that's where I think it's important to make that distinction, is constraints are everywhere, really.
Yeah.
They're not specific to just games-based or drill-based approach.
Right. So a way of maybe using it in rugby might be that post match evaluation, it was determined that long pass accuracy was poor in that game, and then maybe you'd set up a game situation where you've got full width of the field, and maybe you have to create a rule that you have to pass it 3 times or something to score a point, or something along the lines of that. Would that be kind of going down that way?
Exactly. And so I think that's a good example where if we think it's more of a specific skill we want to work on, so passing and long passing in particular, is how do we constrain a game or a drill to get enough of that, but what we use the term repetition without repetition.
Yeah.
To mean that actually it can emerge in all different situations, and the pass can be made at varying speeds of the ball carrier and speeds of the receiver and angles and all those things. Hopefully, this is where the thinking comes in. There's no recipes or answers. You've got to think about this as a coach, how you design something like that to achieve it.
I think ever since the work I've done with you, just experimenting with the constraints-based approaches. It's so much fun as a coach, you get to, you don't need to go on YouTube and look up a magic drill that's going to be the silver bullet. You create it yourself, and then, that one didn't work, so I'm going to change it this way and try again. And then all of a sudden you've got, 15, 20 kind of games and constraints-based approaches that are actually work well, and the kids love it, and it's, there's success as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's good to hear that, mate. That's the case, because that's certainly, I think a ideal outcome. You know, we talk about creativity in players, but for coaches as well, it allows them to apply their creativity exactly how you described. Yeah, you certainly build up. You certainly find out what doesn't work, but for me, that's really good, because you're mirroring the players' learning as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get it wrong. You often learn as much from what doesn't work as what does. So that's actually, I think, even more helpful or beneficial. And I think the other thing is to say that just by, I guess, almost having a lens to look through in terms of some of these skill act principles or constraints-led approaches, it doesn't mean you can't steal, borrow, copy other people's games or drills, but what you can do is start to critique them a bit more and say, right, does it tick these boxes? Perception, action, coupling, variability, those types of things, players having to make decisions and adapt movement. So you can sort of just assess them, and if it stands up, well, yeah, by all means, you can, steal it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 90% of my stuff is stolen in some way. So okay, so just going back a little bit to block practice. For example, staying on passing, catch passing again. The classic one is in rugby is guys getting 4 lines. They run up the field and they pass it with no opposition, offload to another group of 4 coming the other way. And there might be some stationary blocked work before that on technique and things like that. Is there room for block practice in sessions? And if so, what kind of ratio should we be looking at as coaches?
Again, that probably comes back to what I said. There's not necessarily a definitive answer for that. But I more take the approach of work from as far away from that. Start as far away from that as you can. Over time, if you still think, after again observing well, critiquing, trying different things, that the only thing that might get a change is to do some block practice, well, yeah, okay, give it a go. But don't be fooled just because the block practice looks nice on the day or during the session. You still got to be critical with yourself and say, well, has it improved something, on match day and consistently over matches? So, yeah, that's what I say. I wouldn't say don't do it, but it's probably, almost use it as a last resort, and don't do too much of it. Might do a bit of blocked, then put it back, ideally into more of a game context as soon as you can.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, because I think if you pass from one player to another and the pass is accurate and the person catches it, like, who really cares what it looks like? And
we're doing. What I've seen it many times in lots of sports. You do too much of that, what happens is players basically switch off their perception or perceptual skill.
Okay.
Just throwing a pass. They're not having to perceive, scan, read the play, look for, where's the defender or defender's position, where's the space. It's just they run on autopilot, which is what you want. So we don't actually want to get into an automated process. We want to continually be in what we might just call it the technical term metastable, but means yes, we want some stability, but we always need to be able to be adapting as well and changing from a stable base.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, that's really helpful. So then I suppose the next question is you've applied these principles, you've trialed some and it might be a pre-season period or something like that, and then there's an actual game. What are some of the ways that coaches can measure whether what they're doing in the practice is actually transferring to the game?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a good discussion all on its own, I guess, and particularly coming into performance analysis.
Yeah,
and I think some of the measures that would typically be taken are okay as indicators.
Yeah,
but they still probably then require digging into and looking at the video footage to draw your conclusions and work out what's working or what's not. So, it's sort of like process or outcome. I think to get into the process, like you could start looking and counting, if you like, how often players scan or look away from the ball.
Yep.
That's always one thing for me when I watch rugby, say the ball's in the breakdown or something is, fair enough, there's a few guys who are fairly occupied in a physical combat. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of guys standing around who should be looking away from the ball that just seem to watch the ball.
Yeah.
that's sort of like, depending what you're working on, if that's your focus, well, you could start to count those things. But again, but I think there's always got to be a balance and be careful with how you use the data. And skill and learning is a hard thing to measure.
Okay.
So don't get too caught up in trying to. I think you'll get lost down a rabbit hole if you're trying to get too complicated with how you measure stuff.
Yep.
So work out some higher level measures and data to collect, but then back yourself to mix that in with your own observations as a coach.
Yeah. And a previous guest that we had on, Stuart Armstrong, he also said he likes to measure more so attitudes on the field, like is there intent to do the skill correctly rather than was it correctly? I think you risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you're trying to get a black and white picture there.
Yeah, exactly. That I think. As I said, it's almost like the harder you try, the worse it gets, because you end up collecting more data that doesn't really have any value, and you just you spiral negatively. So yeah, absolutely. But I like, as Stuart said, I like that. Think a bit more creatively about what you might look at, observe, measure. And the old saying, well, what is important? What do you value? Try to come up with a way of evaluating that well, which could be through data and measurement, or could just be through some good observation. As well as players' feedback. Don't forget that. That's potentially your most powerful source of information, is how players are feeling and what their perceptions are.
Yeah, absolutely. Wanted to talk then about what are some other methods that coaches can use to try and accelerate this learning. Accelerate's probably the wrong word, but I know we talked a little bit about using analogies and those kind of things. What are some areas they could use as well? Yeah,
so I guess we've talked mainly about with constraints and those sort of things. The practice design is actually designing the activities, whether it's the game or drill. But I guess the coach, in terms of instruction and feedback.
Yeah.
So and analogies particularly. So again, it's not black and white, but there's a suggestion that. Instruction that gets players to focus too much on specific body parts and movements, like hold your hands this way, or your arms should move like that, might actually be detrimental. And of course, it directly conflicts with what we might say is traditional coaching, which is very much like that, which is interesting. But it's not blanket, but generally. So that's where they say that's an internal focus, and maybe we should be trying to generate an external focus, which is, can you make the ball spin a certain way, or analogies, which a lot of coaches, like you said earlier, and it's not a case of stealing others, coming up with your own sort of analogies and kit bag of analogies that might be effective for certain techniques, that sort of take the focus away from the body so much. And putting a focus either externally or just giving them literally that picture to focus on.
No, absolutely. And I think definitely with rugby, the flight of the ball can be a clear focus for sure, and you can get really creative with some of the analogies you can come up with too.
Yeah, exactly. And probably, and this is where, so if we're talking about kicking and conversion kicking for goal, those sorts of things, that's probably where it's most pronounced and proven in terms of a concept they call quiet eye, which tends to be where you focus your attention and visual search, and for how long tends to dictate how accurately you then kick. So it'd be pretty common now, and like I guess the examples with the Johnny Wilkinson in terms of picking the lady holding the Coke can. The goals, so that's that.
Unfortunately,
wide eye.
That was unfortunate for Australia.
Yeah. I shouldn't have mentioned that, should I?
No, he's a legend.
So, but that again, that reinforces actually what we might call having more of an external focus.
Yeah.
Than if he was worried about what's the angle of my foot.
Yeah, on contacting
the ball. Yeah. So it's a process what they call of actually letting the body self-organise. So it's got this propensity actually to be able to self-organise without you trying to consciously control it too much, given enough, practice and exposure to that task.
Yeah. Okay, great. Another thing I've been playing around with a lot in the last couple of years too is as a phys ed teacher, we were always always told through university, like focus on 3 key coaching points and keep referring that. And I've actually started doing a lot where it's just one thing that I focus on with the kids or the guys I coach, and I'm finding that really helps. And again, going to passing, I might just again like just focus on the flight of the ball, or just focus on how my arms look once I've released the ball. What do you think about that in terms of like actually reducing the amount of content coaches give players compared to like increasing it?
Yeah, I think again, as a general rule, it's probably pretty reasonable advice. We probably all do err on, or certainly all get tempted to probably cram too much in there in terms of whether it's learning objectives and what you're supposed to get out of the activity or the actual amount of instruction during. So yeah, less is more is probably a good thing to think about. I think the other thing to consider is on the feedback side as well. I think is self-selected feedback.
Yep.
That's basically where you're putting the ownership and responsibility on the players to seek out feedback when they feel they need it.
Mm-hmm.
So that starts for me. I've used that a bit and spoken to coaches about it, and it tends to work really well once players realise that actually the coach is genuine, that they're going to pretty much let me try and work it out, and unless I go and ask them, they're not necessarily going to give me too much feedback and instruction.
Yeah.
So it works well, because then when they come to you as a coach, it's great because they're genuinely engaged in whatever it might be, and that sort of allows them to play is to dictate their own objectives or what they're trying to get out. So you as a coach don't have to feel like you're explicitly covering it all. So I think that's what can potentially be quite a powerful thing as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. I like that one, and that's kind of like when they do come to you. By the time they've come to you, they've obviously struggled to get to that point. So, and that's where the learning happens during that struggle. So, that's some great advice.
And again, it's not always a panacea. As in, some players will, for various motivational and personality reasons, will come to you almost for reassurance and just to get a pat on the back type of thing. So, but that's just knowing your players and sort of working through that a little bit, and you start to sense, what their motivations are. But in general, I think it can be quite effective.
Okay, great. All right, so with you're now working with some fairly high performance coaches in a very high performance environment. What do you find are some of the things that people struggle with in that environment in terms of applying this kind of stuff, or are the coaches that are coming in, are they already on board with that, or do you get like a mixed bag of people who coach in, say, like a inverted commas traditional style compared to something a bit more contemporary?
Yeah, I think it really is a mix, and it's been, probably should start with my own learning as well. It's been really good for me to start to have to work in non-team sports as well.
Yeah.
So working across a handful of different Olympic sports has been great for my learning as well, and been really useful. And but there are common themes, as in what what we class as traditional methods, interestingly, do seem to run through all different types of sports and coaching. They exist. So it's really interesting to look at the social and cultural reasons for that, but that's a separate issue. But I find that they're more and more receptive. The challenge is, I think, in a high performance right at the top end is buying enough space sort of to go into a learning phase where, like we sort of addressed earlier, you don't necessarily see change quickly.
Yeah.
In some cases where you may see a decrement in performance, so you might feel like you're actually taking a couple of steps backwards before you can go forwards again. And sometimes a high performance environment, so tightly wound to results and immediate performance, isn't conducive to that. So they're all the sort of the balance and tensions that you sort of got to work through in that environment, which is why, and so, for the example that the group you're coaching, Andy, is why the pathway and talent pathway, I think getting these ideas into there could have a massive impact. Because I think if that was all cohesive and lined up, from a kid coming through from, say, 12 through to 20, you would, there's the space to let learning happen. I know coaches still too often get preoccupied with the results and winning, but there is the opportunity, I think, to really create a good environment.
Yeah, almost like a safe environment to make mistakes. And again, that was what Stuart Armstrong from the RFU talked about is, let them make the mistakes there.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, as I said, there's still challenges with that, and sometimes it's the players themselves. So, I've seen examples, again, heard from coaches quite scarily at times, actually, of coaching 9-10-year-olds who the coach tries to use a game-based approach, and the 9-year-old saying, "Why aren't we doing the drills like my mate over in the other team?"
Yeah.
Which is, that becomes, in my world, scary stuff.
Yeah, I think that was one. You might have put it out on Twitter, actually. It's a kid being asked what's dribbling in terms of soccer, and the kid said, "Oh, that's what you do around cones."
Yeah. No, it wasn't me, but I recall that as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Mark. For coaches like moving forward, firstly, like what are some resources they could use as reference material? I know Lynn Kidman from New Zealand's got a great book. I think it's called Developing Decision Making or something along those lines. Do you have any others that are right up there?
Yeah, well, Lynn's fantastic. So anything, I think she's got at least a couple of books out, if not more, probably more. She's worth looking at. I mean, we mentioned Twitter early on, and I'm sure, Andy, if people followed you, you could maybe point them in the direction of others to follow.
Yeah.
To be honest, if it's things, now you've maybe heard some specific terms like constraints-led approach, probably just Googling those will turn up some reasonable articles now. And then after that, you're into more of maybe like the textbooks that offer theory and practical examples. So depending on, your enthusiasm for the topic, I suppose.
Yeah, okay, that's great. And I think what we'll do, like you mentioned earlier, I'll get some links and resources, and we can put that in the show notes so people can access that and take that next step. All right, great. And if people want to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter details?
It's Uppy01 UPPY01.
Okay, great. And you're prolific on Twitter.
Yeah, I tend to do my best work at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's on Twitter, which might be a sad reflection of things.
No, but there's great stuff.
I do. Yeah, actually, I do enjoy it again as much. Well, I think hopefully it helps some others, but actually it's really good for my own development because you get some good conversations and come across some interesting stuff that just forces you to think, which I think is a good thing generally.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I get a lot of value out of what you're putting out, so it's great. And you've also just recently started up a project called myfastestmile. What's that about? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's with a guy that actually was also at the EIS's head of talent science, so Al Smith. So he's not with the EIS anymore, so he's gone out on his own, and we're sort of working on this My Fastest Mile, which doesn't really have anything to do with running or athletics. Actually, it's more about striving to be your best.
Yeah,
continually doing that, and so we're about trying to help people do that, and particularly whilst I work at the more the high performance end, it's actually particularly younger people in sport, participants in sport, and trying to help create the best learning environments, and so coaches are tightly wound up into that, but just look at thinking how can we create the best environments that help young people to be their best, as sporting participants, but also that might transfer across into other areas of their life, which is not unique. There's a heap of people doing some stuff, but we're going to try a couple of things.
Okay, great. And how would people find out more information about that?
They're just myfastestmile.com.
Okay, fantastic. All right, that sounds great. I'll definitely check that out myself.
Yeah.
All right. So to close off the show, we ask a series of questions. Usually they're rugby related, but you're from a non-rugby background, so I'll just make it general.
Very kind of you, man.
Yeah, no worries. When you were a kid growing up, who were some of your favourite athletes that got you interested in sport and things like that?
Well, probably I think as a basketball follower through the 90s, it was hard, I guess, not to be captured by Michael Jordan's efforts. So he was certainly up there. In a range of other sports. I'm trying to think. Oh, cricket actually. It would be interesting. Some of your followers might not be too aware of cricket. Dean Jones was a favourite of mine.
Love him.
Yeah, I think a lot of people our age probably did, Andy.
Yeah.
In cricket, who else? Actually, in Aussie rules, I didn't really have any standout favourite players, but probably Jordan was the clear one for me.
Yeah, and it's a great story too. Like you just like the work ethic of the guy. It's unbelievable.
Yeah,
great. Okay, and currently, who do you like watching running around now?
Yeah, I think it's who I would probably respect the most is Roger Federer. It's hard. I think every time I think of him, just the word class comes to mind. I think he personifies it in every way you can think about that. He's great to watch, and even just recently, made the final, didn't he, of the US Open? I think the other thing that impresses me sort of had a theme of learning today is he represents that as well. Even his new tactic of basically rushing the net off a return of serve. Something he just was experimenting with and thought he'd have a go at. So, I love that mindset. Arguably the greatest player in the world, yet he's still got that sort of growth and learning mindset, which is fantastic.
Fantastic. Yeah, it reminds me of Pat Rafter too. That's a volley game.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, and coaches who are kind of, I suppose, have more of a public profile. Who are some of your favourite coaches going around?
Yeah, again, from what I read, and I have come into contact with a couple of them or heard them speak. So Phil Jackson, again, basketball related with the Bulls and the Lakers. Just his approach was obviously different and highly successful and something that resonates with me. Then Carlo Ancelotti, who obviously in football has been coaching another number of clubs. I like how he's prepared to adapt his style to fit different cultures. So he's coached in a number of different countries in football and soccer. Graham Henry, I think you can't help but be impressed with, again, even a recent article with him back onto learning is talking about, how much he's changed as a coach and realised gone from the typical autocratic command and control style to arguably, obviously one of the most player-centred and player-led programs in the world, and the results are on the board. To probably from Australia, Rick Charlesworth. So hockey, obviously in Australia, a household name, maybe not so much elsewhere, but his mix of experience is quite unbelievable, really, from medicine to politics to hockey to cricket to Aussie rules football for a couple of years. He just brings an incredible mix, and I think that's a really interesting area in coaching is obviously having experience and expertise in your sport or sport in general, but also a diversity of experience is actually, I think, closely wound up with expert coaching. So, he's a good example of that.
Absolutely. You're dealing with human beings, so having a diversity of experience is key. Just on Phil Jackson, I read his book 11 Rings, and I got so much out of that. I thought that was, and I don't even like basketball. I can't watch a game of basketball to save my life. But I found that autobiography was fantastic, and Graham Henry's story is really interesting. It's quite typical of, he's a former teacher, former headmaster. I read his autobiography too, but don't tell anyone. But it's quite typical of teachers to come from that or authoritarian kind of background, and then have to realize, hey, this doesn't exactly work doing it this way. That's great. Okay, and then some who are some coaches who are kind of chipping away in the trenches that you think deserve mention?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can pick out anyone, Andy. But I am, encouraged by. I come into contact with a lot of good, like directly or online, what I think and sense of some really good young coaches in football or soccer, but also rugby and other sports, and I sense that they could make a really valuable contribution if given the opportunity. But that some of them don't have the professional high level playing background. I still just worry a bit whether they're going to get the opportunity that they maybe deserve. But arguably, if they do genuinely deserve it, the opportunity will come at some point. So, actually, I'm encouraged by a number of young coaches who are developing, what you might call all-round skills in understanding people and understanding learning and those types of things.
Yeah, that's great, fantastic. All right, well, thanks very much for joining us. It was great having a chat. I've got a notepad full of notes that I can put in with my other notepad full of notes when we first chatted. But yeah, it was great for me. It really refreshed a lot of the ideas we'd worked on previously, and hopefully the listeners got a bunch out of it. So really appreciate you coming on the show, Mark. Cheers.
Not a problem, mate. And go the Wallabies.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers. Thanks, Mark.
See you, mate.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review via iTunes and keep listening for the next episode. You can also follow us on Twitter at RugbyCoachSCNR or via the website at therugbycoachescorner.com. Until next time, keep sharing ideas to make the game better.